Welcome back, APUSH students. Today is Chapter 37 of the American Pageant, titled The Stormy 60s. If you don't know the American Pageant, it's fine because the content is still going to be the same. I'm going to be going over all the key terms and notes for this chapter that helped me get a 5, so I encourage you to take notes along as well. Once again, before we get into the video, this is a very long chapter, just like the last chapter, so I'm going to try and keep it short and to the point for every term and try not to just extend the video way too long because there is a lot of content. Lyndon B. Johnson, president who took over after Kennedy. He was an experienced politician who aimed at continuing JFK's policies. Although he first presented as a partly conservative, he was actually very liberal and believed in big government and progressivism. A lot of his policies relate to FDR and the New Deal. Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination based on race, sex, and ethnicity. It was a landmark bill that helped to finally solidify American equality principles into law, although practicing equality is never ending, and was the capstone of the civil rights movement. It gave the government more power to end segregation and other forms of discrimination in the workplace or other sectors. Affirmative action, equitable practices boosting minority representation. This is a huge thing in college admissions now. It's been in the news a lot. It was designed to reverse historical discrimination by encouraging employers to hire more minorities, but it controversially evolved into giving minority groups special privileges in certain aspects of life. That is the argument about college admissions trying to admit more minority students. The Other America, book on poverty in America. It exposed the amount of people who lived in poverty, which affluent populations had largely been separated from. It helped to encourage the War on Poverty campaign that put the burden on the government to end poverty. So the government started pumping a lot of money into underprivileged communities. Great Society, Lyndon B. Johnson's reform programs. This is kind of like the New Deal. These programs aligned with a vision of a thriving America for all people. This reform plan led the government to enact more social welfare programs, investments into poverty, and investments into schooling and other activities benefiting society, like the arts. Tonkin Gulf Resolution, Congress giving the executive branch war powers. It greatly expanded the power of the executive branch by essentially giving the president power to declare war and to decide on war policy, specifically applying to Vietnam in this case. Remember, back in the Constitution, most war powers are given to Congress. So how much power this gave the president was a huge deal in terms of separation of powers. Freedom Summer voter registration program. It was a significant period where many black Americans were able to take advantage of the voting rights bill by registering to vote. It brought together blacks and white civil rights workers and volunteers to make sure black people had their voices in government. Selma March led by MLK for voting rights. The march in Alabama was met by heavy resistance. State troopers violently attacked the demonstrators. It showed how civil rights laws, although passed, still needed much work to be practiced. Voting Rights Act of 1965, bill to end racial discrimination in voting. It attacked literacy tests specifically designed to limit underprivileged groups from voting, and it also sent federal agents to support voting registration. This protected the rights of black people to vote. Malcolm X, militant black activist, a different ideology than MLK. He advocated for black separatism as the way for blacks to achieve civil rights, and that white people were devilish towards blacks, so the separation of races was necessary to restore black identity. Black Panther Party, Civil Rights Party. Black Panther Party, Civil Rights Party, this is in relation to Malcolm X. It both advocated for protections against brutality while also kindly serving the community. It put together community issues with long-standing national issues to fight against both types. Black Power, doctrine against the evils of Western civilization. It was designed to uplift blacks into practicing rights guaranteed by civil rights legislation, but also took under a separatist ideology. Stokely Carmichael, civil rights leader and Black Power preacher. He helped to establish the nonviolent idea of Black Power as a central part of the SNCC. He wanted to lead the attack against Western evils. Assassination of MLK. MLK shot in Memphis by a white man. As one of the most influential American leaders in history, his death crushed the American people. His death exacerbated the racial violence in a time where the peaceful MLK was badly needed. Thankfully, his death inspired other leaders to continue MLK's quest. Viet Cong, North Vietnamese communists. They underwent long-lasting guerrilla warfare against South Vietnam. Their attacks encouraged America to send troops to Vietnam, starting the controversial period of Americans on the Vietnam front. This is one of the most controversial wars in American history. Whether Americans should have been involved in the first place has always been debated, and it will go on for a very long time in the 60s and 70s. Hawks v. Doves, battle between pro-war and anti-war members in Washington. This continued the Cold War debate on whether fighting proxy wars was necessary for American capitalist idealism and the protection of democracy. The Hawks were seen by the foreign world as evil, where bystanding countries began to resent American troops. Six-Day War, Israel gaining territory in the Middle East. The results of this war included much Arabian territory and even the Holy Land of Jerusalem under Israeli control. This event pinned resentful Palestinians against expanding Israelis, continuing the Jew-Arab conflicts in the Middle East history. This obviously right now is a huge deal, the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's a conflict that's been going on for a very long time. There's a lot of history. This is just one piece of it. Teach-ins, anti-war teachings on school campuses. These anti-war protests aimed at Vietnam eventually expanded to widespread anti-war demonstrations that even led draftees to protest draft legislation publicly. It posed a serious threat to the government when its own people didn't back their war. It's just another example of how a lot of progressivism movements start on college campuses and in schools with young people. Credibility gap, loss of credibility towards the government. It was largely sparked by the Vietnam War. Americans began to lose faith in the American government at accelerating rates. Americans began questioning the wisdom of American idealism and what it meant for foreign policy. This credibility gap becomes a huge theme of government throughout the 60s and 70s. COINTELPRO, Domestic Counterintelligence Program. This was led by the FBI. It greatly exceeded the FBI's and the government's power as the state began spying on anti-war activists. As the FBI carried out false communist accusations against dissenters, the FBI took on a totalitarian mold as an expanding and corrupt bureaucracy. Around this time, evidence also came out that the FBI was spying on MLK and Malcolm X and other things like that. Tet Offensive, Communist Offensive in Vietnam. It was majorly successful from the communist side, but it completely shattered any American faith in the Vietnam War as Johnson's strategy of escalation towards victory was exposed as being a failure. American Independent Party, third party in American politics. It was separated from the dominant Democrat and Republican parties. It played as a spoiler in national elections. Their leader, George C. Wallace, was a vicious racist and war hawk who appealed to fears over actual good policy, displaying how intense political divisions led to populist politics. Free speech movement, protests against traditional controlling establishments. It showed how young people were becoming restless with conformity and how they wanted to open up spaces for debate, conversation, and new ideologies. Unfortunately, counterculture movements dwindled out into reality-rejecting hippies, and young people turned radically against any form of social institutions. So the free speech movement kind of turned on its head. It went so overly progressive and overly out there that it almost turned itself around, and then the counterculture people began rejecting traditional, taking away their free speech, and it was this whole thing. So counterculture versus traditionalism just became this battle. Sexual revolution, advancements of sexual freedom and expression. Although mostly an ideology, it led to practical advancements in birth control and freedom of sexual expression, eventually expanding to gay tolerance pushed by liberals and young people. Stonewall Rebellion, attack on gay people. Innocent gay men were attacked by policy, and when they hit back, it escalated into more violence and worse intentions surrounding the sexual revolution. Innocent gay men were attacked by police, and when they hit back, it escalated into more violence and worse intentions surrounding the sexual revolution. Students for a Democratic Society, youthful campaigns against war and poverty. When it eventually progressed into violent protests and domestic terrorism, it showed how lust for youthful idealism had evolved dangerously due to unrest. Counterculture, youthful turn against traditionalism. Although it didn't end American traditionalism totally, it weakened the importance of those values in society, which came with both advantages and disadvantages on the future of civilization. Vietnamization, withdrawing troops from Vietnam. Under this gradual troop pullout, the plan was to have the South Vietnamese eventually take over the war. Although it was good to pull out the troops, the vision for South Vietnam being able to continue on its own was a pipe dream. So pulling out of Vietnam was just spelling the end of the war for the communists to take over Vietnam. Nixon Doctrine, American defense but not intervention. It reversed Cold War foreign interventionism, putting America first principles back to the forefront, specifically about American defense of other democratic nations. America no longer wanted to send troops to foreign wars to die. Silent majority, people who rejected counterculture and anti-war/patriotism. Nixon valued them as a powerful base and wanted to appeal to them through rhetoric and policy. Nixon and his administration labeled the counterculture protests as bums, which fed into the traditionalist people's views against the negative aspects of the youthful generation. My Lai massacre, slaughter of Vietnamese civilians by American troops. It deepened the distaste among Americans for the war in Vietnam and the American interventionist military as a whole. It fits into a larger narrative of how American troops and their conquest of idealism was not always moral and good. That's a huge problem with foreign intervention and just foreign policy as a whole, is that American ideals are not always good for the rest of the world, and when America commits these transgressions, it fires back really bad on a country that always wants to stand for freedom and things like that. Kent State University, site of police shootings involving protesters. At an anti-war protest against the U.S.-South Vietnam invasion into Cambodia, protesters were shot and killed by National Guard forces, yet another incident undermining faith in the U.S. government. Détente, policy and period of relaxed tension. Policies of détente helped to make the two rivaling sides come to significant agreements and treaties that further relax tensions, especially militarily. Détente policies helped to slow the arms race. This was between America and the Soviet Union. Philadelphia Plan, affirmative action plan for unions. It established hiring quotas and employer practices that applied to minority groups, which transform affirmative action to handing out privileges to groups based on race and sex. A clear example of discrimination. These privileges help to offer opportunities for minorities and women, but it brought up a new question on how discrimination could be remedied justifiably. This is just an example of a debate between how far can you go to help out minority groups without discriminating against majority groups. Can you discriminate against majority groups? It's all that goes into the affirmative action debate. Environmental Protection Agency, just the EPA, federal organization addressing environmental concerns. It helped to give federal representation to the growing group of environmentalists who were becoming increasingly vocal about their concerns for the future of the environment. Silent Spring, book by an environmentalist. It raised concerns for the environment, specifically how commonly used pesticides harm plant life. Lobbying through the EPA, it helped to create federal environmental laws. Southern Strategy, holding back on liberal civil rights policy. These policies helped to move the disillusioned and racist Southern Democrat group into the Republican Party in a vast political realignment during the 60s. The Republican Party consolidated old thinkers who could not keep up with civil rights into their population to bolster their political power in numbers. So the Republican Party sort of embraced traditional values, traditionalist culture, and that had the effect of taking a lot of Southern Democrats in who were not happy with how progressive the party was going, and just on the far side, just the racist people who were not in tune with the civil rights movement. War Powers Act, limiting presidential war powers. It responded to all the concerns about Nixon abusing his power during the Vietnam War and the Cambodian bombings, which helped to pull back some of the expanding military executive powers observed during the Cold War. It started the trend of new isolationism that valued being conservative and cautious, but still being based in interventionism and idealism. Yom Kippur War between Egypt/Syria and Israel. In order to protect Israel, the U.S. had to go against the oil-rich nations of the Middle East. This created tension with the Middle Eastern oil giants that the West relied on heavily for energizing their economies. A massive oil problem is about to hit the United States in this period. Arab oil embargo, Middle East stopping oil shipping to America. OPEC enacted an embargo on shipping to America, which cut off the West from oil supplies. This started a bowling ball effect that led to a recession where America even had to start rationing gas. It also exposed the negative aspects of America depending on other countries for things as crucial as energy. And that's a wrap. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next chapter, and goodbye.